This past July, I turned 18, which meant a lot of things. I could be drafted into the military, buy a gun, take out a bank loan, but God forbid I wanted to purchase alcohol or rent a car. Ridiculous. Really though, one thing I was genuinely really excited about was being able to vote for the first time. I've always been fairly invested in politics from the time I was young, so pretty much the second that I could, I registered to vote. Finally, all those clusters of political signs on nearly every green space in my hometown would finally mean something. Or so I thought. Becoming an active participant in the political process for the first time, as well as being someone who's pretty passionate about design and aesthetics, made me realize how many candidates' designs suck. So many are ridiculously bland and all melt together into one big slop of red, white, and blue. Others are just plain weird and make no sense at all. I've started to ask myself, how did we get here? Does the seemingly boring branding of modern political candidates actually work? What does it even mean for campaign branding to work in our heavily polarized country that we live in today? Well, in order to answer these questions, we need to look at how political campaigns have reached the state that they're in today. Then we can analyze what ideas have influenced how campaign branding is designed today and how those ideas have been put into practice. Finally, we can talk about why any of this even matters in the first place. This is Inside the Images, analyzing campaign branding. The US has been running federal elections since the Constitution was ratified in 1788. The concept of campaigning to the public wasn't really at the front of any politician's mind at the time, though, as elections were decided almost exclusively through legislators rather than common citizens. This all started to change during the 1828 presidential election, as states across the country started to eliminate the requirement of owning property in order to vote. Now, politicians couldn't just rely on newspaper articles read by educated white men or speeches to legislative bodies. They had to appeal to a much more diverse group of people who have varying levels of education, values, and interests. Thus, a very basic form of political branding was born. Candidates had to make their message quicker and more accessible while still being effectively convincing and able to mobilize voters. This early era of political media gave us things like the symbol of an elephant for the Republican Party and a donkey for the Democratic Party. The 15th Amendment in 1870 and the 19th Amendment in 1920 diversified voting demographics even more and expanded the voting base far beyond what it was originally, motivating campaigns to further tailor their messaging in order to reach vastly different people across the country. Technology complicated this even more still, as campaign branding had to be suitable for things like mass-produced print, television, and nowadays even social media. Campaigns run today certainly look very different from how they did initially, and the branding has changed along with it. Campaign designers have become well aware of this, and it's a consideration they have to use in their work if they want it to be effective. A lot of research goes into the voting base a certain candidate will be presented to, whether the election is at a small scale or national. A really easy way to demonstrate this is how candidates choose to represent or hide their party affiliation in their messaging. When you look at most campaign logos, it isn't immediately clear which party the candidate is affiliated with. If you know a lot about design or the symbolism of color or font, you might be able to figure it out, but the average voter most likely isn't. Campaign designers know this, which is why they play into design choices that they think will make their candidate recognizable and help them perform better. Semiotics refers to the study of the use of signs and signals to promote a certain interpretation of a symbol. This is the reason why we know that a red octagon means stop, or why two golden arches get us thinking about salty french fries and greasy hamburgers. Semiotics is a powerful tool that can allow people to influence our thoughts and feelings when we're confronted with deceptively simple symbols. In political branding, iconographic symbols are used, but oftentimes a much larger emphasis is placed on things like font and color choices. Studies have shown that serif fonts are more often perceived as conservative compared to sans serif. There's also evidence to suggest that bolded fonts are perceived to lean more conservative and italics to lean more progressive. There are a multitude of different possibilities for why this perception exists. Maybe bold serif fonts are seen as more traditional and stout, common characteristics associated with the Republican Party. Maybe italicized sans serif fonts are seen as more modern and suggest progress, things that are associated with the Democratic Party. Differences between these fonts can seem subtle, but these differences have major implications on how the things they're associated with are used. To better understand this, let's look at the race in Virginia's 10th district from the 2020 congressional election. Now, I picked this district at random, but it represents a phenomenon that's seen all across the country. Now, this district encompasses a large region of Northern Virginia, close to DC. There's a high proportion of college-educated, wealthy voters, which would suggest that most people living there have the capability to critically analyze the candidates they're voting for. The district flipped to become solidly Democratic after Jennifer Wexton defeated then-incumbent Barbara Comstock in 2018, overturning a seat held by Republicans since 1980. In the 2020 election, Wexton ran in an attempt to maintain her seat and was challenged by Republican Alicia Andrews. Let's look at their campaign logos side by side. While they're clearly distinct from one another, there's a very apparent similarity. They both predominantly use the color blue. Now, in modern elections, typically, Democrat equals blue and Republican equals red, a phenomenon that appeared around the 2000 presidential election. So, is Andrews' team purposefully trying to trick predominantly Democratic voters into thinking he's one of them? Well, I don't know that our campaign team would exactly admit to that, but essentially, maybe. Okay, I don't mean to say that this is an explicitly deceptive tactic, but with how partisan American politics has become, there's limited strategies that a challenger can use to campaign against the incumbent in a stronghold for their party. Now, it may just be that blue is a more versatile color than red, as Republican candidates were still 2 times more likely to use red as their main color in districts that were solidly Democratic, and Democrats and Republicans overall were both more likely to use blue than any other color. This phenomenon of using the dominant party's color, however, is referred to as one of many micro-trends in campaign branding by Kevin Weisner, a partner at the Center for American Politics and Design, a digital archive project of every congressional and presidential candidate from the 2018 election, a project that's the first of its kind and gives so many insights into the trends we're seeing in political branding today. While not every challenger uses this color swapping tactic, it's one that's seen in many places across the country with vastly different voter demographics, like Indiana's 9th district, which has a median income well below the national average, as well as remained a Republican stronghold for decades. Look at their candidates' logos. Or take California's 11th district, which Democrats have securely held since 2006 and has a median income significantly higher than the nation's average. Similar phenomenon. The point is, no matter where the race is in the country, whether the voters there are educated and wealthy or not, there seems to be a lot of cases where much more priority is put on appealing to the voter base rather than focusing on the policies and values of the candidate themselves. Now, is this an effective tactic? Well, if by effective you mean winning, not necessarily. Strongholds are strongholds for a reason, and a simple color swap isn't going to sway most voters when a candidate's political party is usually listed on the voting ballot itself. But campaign managers aren't stupid. There's a reason why they try using this tactic, and this imagery still plays a bigger role in people's perception of candidates than they'd maybe like to admit. However, there are still some cases when political branding can really make an impact on how a candidate is perceived and may cause some unexpected election results. In October 2024, a little-known New York State Assemblyman by the name of Zohran Mamdani announced his campaign for mayor of New York City. When the polls for the race first opened, he stood at a whopping less than 1% of votes. Flash forward to today, and he won the seat by 9.5 percentage points over establishment Democrat Andrew Cuomo. This underdog story wasn't exactly the only time this has happened in a major election, with candidates like Harry Truman and Jimmy Carter coming from behind during their own campaigns to win. This win was different, though, for a number of reasons. Mamdani is a 34-year-old Muslim South Asian, the youngest mayor of New York in over a century, and also the only Muslim to ever hold the office. He's also a proud democratic socialist during an era when the Democratic Party's messaging seems to sway closer to centrist policies every year. He faced countless attacks on his character during the race due to his religion and stance on various controversial issues, all while making historic gains across multiple demographics, including young, black, and Latino working-class voters. Mamdani's campaign was a masterclass of establishing a clear, unique, and appealing identity as a politician, and so many others seem like they're doing the opposite, hoping that if they come across neutral enough, they'll win over the votes they need to get elected. There are many aspects of the Mamdani campaign that can be analyzed, but for the sake of my argument, we're going to look at his branding specifically and why it worked so well. Okay, now, looking at his branding, I know what you're probably thinking. Noah, you just spent so long talking about how tired and unindividual and basic red and blue lettering is. Also, didn't you say this guy was a democratic socialist? Why is he using a serif font? Isn't that the Republican one? This is all going against every point you just made. That's a fair reaction. Mamdani's branding probably doesn't look like much for someone living outside of New York City. Sure, there's a few pops of bright colors, but it just feels like a typical logo with the candidate's name written in the tried and true, patriotic red and blue. But for native New Yorkers, so much of Mamdani's branding is pure genius. The mastermind behind most of his campaign brand was designer Anish Bhapathi, who had worked on multiple campaigns for Democratic Socialists in the past. Anish reported that Zohran himself was heavily involved throughout the design process, pushing the designs to be even more bold and expressive than Anish had originally created. Let's take a deeper look into the coloring of this logo. While Mamdani appears to stick with the safe option of red and blue, maybe being slightly adventurous with the addition of a bright yellow, these colors mean so much more to New Yorkers. The colors represent the identity of the city itself, representing cultural icons and ideas that are so familiar with New Yorkers old and young. The brand guide composed for the campaign claims that the color palette reflects the vibrant, primary colors that help bodega signage and cab livery stand out in busy New York streets. Whether it's on a bodega awning, one of the thousands of cabs that fill the city streets, or the iconic Metro card, the colors used in the Mamdani campaign are some that citizens see throughout their communities in a really identifiable way, giving the messaging a much more personal and connected feeling. It doesn't feel corporate or stale, like a design created in a boardroom. It feels like it was made by somebody who truly knows and loves the city, which seemed to resonate with voters in the mayoral election. Speaking of corporate, the coloring isn't the only aspect of the design that feels personal to New Yorkers. While, yes, I mentioned that serif fonts are usually associated with tradition and history, those aren't ideas that are exclusive to the Republican Party. But Pathy describes how the typeface he chose to use was meant to be representative of the traditional hand-painted signage seen on bodegas across the city. The semiotic influence of both the typeface and coloring of Mamdani's branding signifies community and connection, and reminds voters of why they love the city that they live in. In my opinion, what really made Mamdani's campaign branding so successful was how it boldly and confidently portrayed an attitude of hope and progress. It told voters that Zoran was no typical establishment figure, that he was willing to go against the status quo and fight for the needs and wants of the everyday citizen, not the out-of-touch billionaire. Of course, there were many other aspects of his campaign that added to this and made it successful, including, the actual platform of policies that he was running on, but the branding was certainly a key piece of the winning formula, as so many have recognized. His success also demonstrates how much more nuance and context there is that goes into branding that I don't have time to get into in this video, whether it's subverting typical party themes or including nods to the location of his voters. He's also certainly not the only politician that's gone outside the box when it comes to design choices, but I still do think that analyzing Mamdani's campaign gives us great insight into what can happen when design and branding is used effectively. Even though I was thrilled at the opportunity to vote the second that I turned 18, I know so many people my age did not share that same excitement. Honestly, I don't really blame them. Politics these days can so often feel like a losing game, especially for young people who feel like the system is too corrupt and manipulative for an individual to have any sort of impact. But that mindset could be something that's so dangerous to fall into as a collective. No matter how much we try to stay out of politics, they're very much going to affect us. I argue that instead of shying away or allowing ourselves to become fatigued by the constant avalanche of political messaging and branding, we look deeper into how these candidates and campaign teams are actually trying to influence us. In Ways of Seeing, John Berger emphasized the difference between seeing and looking, the involuntary influx of information we passively consume versus the voluntary practice of critically analyzing visual information. We need to become aware of what we're seeing, who made it, and for what purpose. We also need to be conscious of our own biases and how what we might see might be different from what others see. If we really, truly make an effort to do this, we can resist manipulation and corruption and make decisions based on who we truly believe to represent our best interests, rather than just sticking to party lines and maintaining the status quo. It's hard to feel in control when you don't even know what to believe in, so the first step should be to weed out the fluff and see things for what they really are. Obviously, there's much more to candidates than the logo on their yard signs, but noticing them and analyzing them can be a really good place to start. That way, the next time you see them, your reaction is based on rationality and not subconscious association that they want you to have. I'm sure that many candidates will try to push the boundaries of what political branding should be, while others keep doing things the way they've always been done. What's most important is that we understand how they affect us so that we can control the future of politics instead of it controlling us.